Well, hi there. So this is our practice set for long-run policy implications. And it'll maybe help you think about some of the ideas that I talked about in that lecture video. So for each of these, we're just going to complete the table by circling or by putting an arrow or no change. For the first one, it says, imagine that they use expansionary fiscal policy. And so, the tools of that are taxes, transfers, and government spending. And so expansionary would mean that we increase government spending or we decrease taxes. And that's going to move the budget balance, which is the fancy way of saying, like, how is the government's budget look, moves it toward either a surplus or toward a deficit. And when you're bringing in less money and you're spending more of it, that moves you toward a deficit. So that has the effect of increasing the debt, right? And when the government is borrowing more money, right, we'd say over here that it increases the demand for loanable funds. One thing we also learned in 8.4, right, this is again a plug for review that if you need to, is that sometimes you could say that the government is also reducing the supply of loanable funds. So that's an alternative perspective on this exact same question. Either one, though, are going to cause the real interest rate to go up. And so that's the idea of saying, what's going to happen to crowding out? Well, investment spending goes down and long run growth goes down because people aren't able to borrow and expand their businesses and so forth. And so, this is that chain of logic and thinking about the different directions that can go. If they're contractionary, it's going to look like everything in reverse. They cut government spending, they raise taxes, it moves them to a surplus, reduces the debt, decreases demand, increases supply, reduces the interest rate. So it's basically the reverse of everything there. Now, the second part of this is thinking about monetary policy implications, like why what we do with monetary policy might be something we think about. And it says we expect that larger budgets, and this is actually kind of coming out of this, larger budget deficits and debt cause higher interest rates, which governments are obligated to pay. The current U.S. interest payments are slightly less than $400 billion. Central banks can counteract these higher rates and help governments borrow more by buying government bonds. But this process, known as monetizing the debt, is not without cost. During World War II, the Fed actually did this, but since the 50s, the Fed has avoided doing it because of the cost that we're actually going to see as we walk through this. So let's go through these. If the central bank buys bonds, we know the money supply gets bigger, right? That's a really important learning lesson out of Unit 8. If the money supply gets bigger, then at this point we should know that the nominal interest rate should fall, right? That's again Unit 8. So this is all just Unit 8 at this point. If this is scary, you need to go back and review your Unit 8 stuff. If the money supply gets bigger, the supply of loanable funds should increase. So we have this kind of connection between, the supply of money goes up, therefore we'd say supply of loanable funds goes up. If that's true, then the real interest rate should go down, just like the nominal interest rate would go down in the money market, right? So this one is the money market, and this one is the loanable funds market, thinking about two different markets there. If real interest rate goes down, then what happens to consumption and investment? Well, they're going to go up. And that's probably the whole point of the government buying these government bonds. But this is where things could get a little troubling, right? If consumption and investment go up, then we know AD goes up, and that causes prices to rise. So this stuff is Unit 7, right? And this stuff is Unit 8. And if prices are going up, that's a problem, right? The cost is higher prices, inflation. And there are costs associated with it. We remember that it costs savers and people on fixed incomes. We know that there's shoe leather costs. We know that there's menu costs. We know that there's unit of account costs. And so we don't want to get into this constant cycle of just saying more of this is okay. It's costly. So we definitely don't want to monetize the debt. We wouldn't want the Fed saying, you know what, government, you got yourself in a pinch on debt. Let's help you out. Because that can cost everybody in society. We call it an inflation tax. So rather than going through this whole process, maybe a thinking process to think that maybe we should be more careful when we use fiscal policy. We shouldn't just be borrowing money willy-nilly for any old thing. We should be really thoughtful about when we do it. All right, so there's your long run implications practice. Hopefully it helped you. See you next time.